few others get settled in virtually here, I can see a few others still connecting to audio, and we're thrilled to have you all back. Those of you that were here with us last week and experienced our technical difficulties, we taken a few steps to make sure that we actually get Dr. Winters to get through his entire webinar, and we'll hopefully have some time for questions. We thought about trying to pick up where we left off, but I think it's probably easier. We decided to be easier just to start from the beginning. So let's try that. I think just about everybody is settled in. My name is some of you may know, my name is Steve Steiny. I'm one of the managers here with the American Indian Alaska Native Addiction Technology Transfer Center. I am broadcasting to you live from the University of Iowa campus here at the College of Public Health on the 4th floor. I always say it's the 4th floor that's the coolest floor. We've got 5 floors, and the 4th floor is my favorite. I may be a little biased, but anyway, if you're ever on campus, please let me know. I'll come up and say hello. I'd love to meet some of you face to face. I feel like I know many of you, having done so many webinars over the last 2+ years with all of you. We are once again, just want to check and make sure everybody can see my share screen okay. Are we seeing that introductory slide? I see a couple of heads nodding yes. And then there's my colleague, Parker. He will be assisting with us today to get things started, to make sure that we don't have any major glitches. If you are having issues with your audio or video, send him a message in the chat and he can try and help problem solve or troubleshoot with you. And of course, we have back with us Dr. Ken Winters. I talked him into coming back and trying this again. So Ken, we're
no problem.
Happy to have you back. And I think I'll just zip through these introductory slides, and we will do a brief land acknowledgement as well before we get started. And then I'm going to turn the floor over to him. Really happy to have you all back with us. We've got a nice return audience. So let's see if we can, everybody cross your fingers, and let's see if we can do this. So again, I'm Steve Steiny. I'm one of the managers here at the American Indian Alaska Native ATC. And this is our Essential Substance Abuse Skills Training broadcast. And today we are rebroadcasting the adolescent brain maturation and health intersections on the developmental highway with Ken Winters here as our speaker. So I'll just go through a couple of quick slides. This event, as you know, is brought to you by the National American Indian Alaska Native ATC. We are a national center made up of 10 regional centers, as well as an ATC coordinating office and a national Hispanic and Latinx ATC here in the United States. This project is supported and funded by SAMHSA, and the content is developed by the presenter, and the opinions expressed today do not necessarily reflect the views or policies of SAMHSA HHS or the National American Indian Alaska Native ATC. Following today's event, we will reach out to you via email. We will include a PDF version of today's slides. You can also request 1.5 NADAC approved CEUs, and we are recording this broadcast. You can view this at our Native Center for Behavioral Health website. We have a YouTube archive there. If you're interested in that link, Parker can post that link in the chat. If you don't have that link already, it's a great resource if you're looking for recorded presentations, especially over the past 2.5 years, as we've done a lot of virtual webinars. Lastly, we will ask if you would take a few moments to fill out a short survey. This is a confidential survey. It's not mandatory. It can't be linked to you in any way personally, but we would really appreciate hearing back from you. This short survey satisfies our funders and helps us continue to provide events such as this. If you have any questions about that survey, feel free to reach out to Parker or myself, and we're happy to answer any questions. Before we get started and I turn the floor over to Dr. Winters, I want to just take a moment. I know we're gathered here virtually today, but we want to take time to acknowledge the land and pay respect to the indigenous nations whose homelands were forcibly taken and inhabited. Please take a moment to read this land acknowledgement, which was created by 3 members of our team, Ella and Keely Driscoll and Mr. Sean Bear. Thank you. Well, without further ado, I want to reintroduce my colleague and friend, Dr. Ken Winters. Ken has been a consultant with us for many years, and he is a senior scientist at the Oregon Research Institute, and he was also connected to the University of Minnesota as a professor in the Department of Psychiatry, where he founded and directed the Center for Adolescent Substance Abuse Research for many years. His primary research interests are adolescent health, with a focus on substance use disorders and co-occurring mental health and behavioral disorders. So I want to just turn the floor over to him at this time. Remember, you're currently muted. We're going to use the chat box feature, the hand raise feature, and at some point, we're hoping to have a little time at the end if you would like to unmute and maybe ask a question directly or have a comment for Dr. Winters as we conclude today's webinar. So once again, I want to thank everyone for being here. I'm going to let Dr. Winters say hello, and I'm going to stop sharing this screen and pull up his slides for today. So just give me one moment.
Thanks, Steve.
And the floor is yours.
And hello, everyone. Thank you for attending. My apologies if you're going to hear a little repetition in the early slides, because I thought I just would start over. I think we got cut off around minute 20 or so last week. But hopefully you will still benefit from an interesting talk. I would like to think the topic area is just growing in fascination among clinicians and researchers. And with new technologies, we're learning more and more about brain maturation during the adolescent years. We all realize there is a lot of brain development and growth during childhood, but it turns out there's quite a bit of interesting additional maturation going on in adolescence, and that can tell us a lot about health. Go to the next, Steve. And thank you, Steve, for your willingness to help out with moving these slides along. And I appreciate also the wonderful work of Parker, who behind the scenes has helped immensely in pulling this together. I don't have any professional disclosures, but in the next slide, I have a personal disclosure. You might have heard this from last time. I'm hoping to avoid the concern once voiced by the famous Italian-American physicist Enrico Fermi, who had this reaction after he attended a seminar, hit the space bar. Steve, I'll need to go ahead and hit next because it's an animation slide. And this famous physicist said, "Before I came here, I was confused about this subject. Having listened to your lecture, I am still confused, but on a higher level." So I'm hoping, I guess, that I want to have the same reaction, that you're no more on a higher level. Perhaps there'll be some confusion, but I'm hoping that you will elevate your interest and your knowledge about this topic. So briefly, some resources, and these are either free resources or some links to YouTube's videos. A PDF from the National Academies Press, that was published a little time back called The Promise of Adolescence, The Opportunity for Realizing All of Youth. It's a wonderful resource. Next. A book I like, there are several. If you Google adolescent brain development, you get several books on the market. Anthony Wolf's is one I prefer. The full title, Get Out of My Life, and then the subtitle, But First Could You Drive Me and Cheryl to the Mall? And a book that I think does a nice job of representing the chaos that sometimes occurs, or the contradictions that occur in a teenage brain, and what can happen in some heated emotional conversations between teens and adults. Next is a YouTube video. This is from Professor Sarah Jane Blakemore. It's a TED Talk, well done. It's titled The Mysterious Workings of the Adolescent Brain. And she does a great job of quickly and concisely detailing some of the things we'll talk about today. And then she gets into some of her research. But I think it's the best YouTube video on this topic. The next slide is my reference to real experts, that is teenagers. So there are several. This one from Native Americans. And I thought it did a nice job within about a 10-minute YouTube of teens discussing challenges, successes, joys, frustrations of being a teenager in today's world, with some references to being a Native American teen. Next is a reference to Harvard's podcast series. It's called The Brain Architects, is the name of the full series. A quote from their website: learn the science behind how brains are built and what it means how to build a strong brain. And there's the link. So there are already several installments of this podcast, but it's an ongoing. So if you get on their mailing list, you can see the continuation of their work. Many of their presentations have to do with childhood as well as adolescence. A cautionary note, my first one. There's a lot of spotlight today on my talk on how brain development with the strong biological component impacts adolescent health, but I don't want you to think that the environment and social determinants have a minimal role, because they have a major role also on adolescent behavior. I will delve somewhat into it, particularly with reference to whether you've been exposed to trauma or not, and then as well as a little sidebar topic on the impact of social media on teenage behavior. But when you reflect on all of the slides and think of the talk, one realizes I did go fairly biological with much of the content, but as we all know, biology is not destiny, and people's behavior, regardless of what age, are of course a complex interaction of one's biological features and characteristics, as well as their environment and social determinants. And we also know it's not just a one-way direction, it's bi-directional. The environment can in fact impact biology. To bring this home, I want to show you this native ecological model that I think does a nice job of providing a framework for understanding behavioral health. There are 4 main domains in this model: individual, peers, and family, and then the third, community, including your tribal community, and then society and culture at large. And all of these influences can bring protection and risk when it comes to understanding human behavior. And to the left, I've just highlighted a couple American Indian Alaska Native risk factors that other cultures would not have experienced or are experiencing, that being the historical trauma as well as the negative influence of boarding schools. But we'll focus a lot on the individual, but keep in mind, of course, that there's so many other domains and complex aspects within those domains that are part of one's inner circle, like your peers and family, and then the broader environment that includes the community and society at large. Next. My second cautionary note is that the science that I'm going to be describing is still quite early. One could say it's an infant level science, so it has a lot of development to go. Part of the problem is the studies typically do not have large samples and are not diverse in terms of ethnicity and race. And hit the animation, or then hit next, Steve, because there's an animation coming up. Here we go. Just a reminder that the national level study is being conducted called the Adolescent Brain Cognitive Development Study, funded by National Institute of Health. And we're going to learn a lot more about the what goes on with brain development during the adolescent years, and what kinds of paths lead teenagers to be healthy, and what paths may contribute to mental illness and drug abuse, or both sets of domains. We'll learn more about the outcome of those studies real soon. The ABC, Adolescent Brain Cognitive Development Study, has just gotten started. So it's, I can anticipate even next year, there'll be some findings I can report on, because I think all 13,000 children have been enrolled. And so now they're starting to follow and measure things downstream. Hopefully the study could go on for decades, and maybe we'll at some point learn about the outcome at age 35 of those that were in the original study, and people can take a very long prospective look at how things unfold, and what kind of paths occur as people grow up and develop and move out of adolescence into adulthood. Okay, the next study is slide. Is a development quiz. So I've got 3 questions, and I'm going to give you the questions and the possible answers, and then we'll return to this at the end. Question 1, 2 health indices that suggest teenagers are taking less risk than in years past are the decline in teenage pregnancy and the very low rate of cigarette smoking. So are these 2 health indices occurring which at a less risk level, true or false? Second true-false question, the brain development of native adolescents follows the same principles as with non-native adolescents. True or false? And then multiple choice question, number 3, which is more harmful to the developing brain? Regular use of high potency cannabis, regular binge drinking, or regular vaping of nicotine? 3 substance related options, and wanting you to think about what might be more or less harmful to that adolescent developing brain. We'll come back to them later. Next slide. My talk is really revolving around 2 big content areas. Want to first hit home why we might be interested in brain development science when you're working with young people in prevention and treatment. The second big area will be the major overview of what we're learning about adolescent brain development. And then I go into several sidebars about impact of drug use, mental health, early experiences, and social media on brain development. And then summary at the end. And I thought it'd be helpful just to let you know what are the major points of my talk. So right off the bat, I want you to know kind of where I'm going, and you'll see how I'm going to stitch together all kinds of information to come to these major summary points. The first one, service providers can leverage teen brain science when working with adolescents and parents. Hopefully you'll see that, and how it's great to supplement what you're already doing with teen brain science. Second point, the maturation of adolescent brain likely contributes to behaviors that are characteristics of this developmental period. So we'll get into how some of the tendencies, biases, the excesses, if you will, of adolescent lifestyle and behaviors and choices can be informed by our understanding of the brain and the way it's maturing. And I think this maturation science helps us understand why adolescence is unfortunately a high-risk period for developing substance use disorders and other mental and behavioral disorders, which of course hits home the importance of prevention and early treatment. Okay, so first big topic area, I want to give you the relevance of all this science first. Hopefully this will give you great interest in how you want to use it. The details of that science is coming up, but I want to excite you about the topic by showing you, well, why does it matter to you in the work you're doing? Next slide. One way that I think it can be helpful is just directly teaching young people about brain development and its importance on health and personal growth. We've seen a lot of great interest in teenagers in the science underlying brain maturation research. And I think it adds new insights for them about what they're going through as a teenager. Next. One of the main emphasis that we place on this science is how the way the brain is developing does make some challenges for decision making of the teenager. And these challenges sometimes can lead to risky decisions that can lead to problems. And so, but the teen brain is able to adapt and can resist perhaps what could be called harmful or unwise decision making. And so we like to go down the path of teaching teenagers about how to take good risks that can promote personal growth, how to learn second thought skills. Second thought is where you don't immediately jump to the first thought that comes to mind, but you pause, reflect, and you consider options and show behavior that reflects secondary thinking. And then an important feature, how to avoid peer pressure or peer influences that can lead to substance use and other delinquent-like behaviors. Next. If you're interested in a resource that is geared for teachers and prevention specialists and treatment providers when working with teens and want to teach teen brain science and some of these issues about how to improve decision-making, feel free to email me. We have put together a free resource. It includes PowerPoint file, a Word doc, and a PDF. And so the PowerPoint file is kind of the mini manual. It guides you how to talk about the science, gives you a little, brief primer to the young people about what you're going to see coming up, how the brain develops during the adolescent years and why that's important to a teenager. But then the PowerPoint file guides you to some exercises, and you use the supplemental materials for those exercises and activities. So it's not just a resource where you're going to have to do lecturing and perhaps put teenagers to sleep, but we've included some activities that hope promote the ideas and give a little interest and excitement to the topic area. Useful group setting, classroom, prevention programs, probably 60-minute type time frame to it when it comes to using all of the resources. And of course, you could surely add to it. The PowerPoint and the Word doc are, amenable to changes. So you surely can add some personalized information to those files that make sense for what you're doing and make it more relevant to your audiences. Next. Another principle is the value of using evidence-based prevention programs. That's related to teen brain science because my view of the most effective prevention programs, either formally or informally, incorporated knowledge about adolescent brain development and capitalized on that so that it could optimize the effectiveness of the prevention curriculum and content. You see here 3 sources of summaries of effective prevention programs and links and connections to where you can get those specific prevention programs. So I have 3 of them here. They overlap to some degree, but boy, they're all pretty good. So I gave gave you all of them on this slide. I suppose if I had to choose one, I'd go right to NIDA as the number one document. All of them are free downloads, but they're useful if you're still wondering about, well, am I using a good prevention program? You could compare what you're doing to what might be viewed as evidence-based in these resources, or if you're window shopping for a program, you have an option to see what's out there. Some programs cost money, I know, but some are public domain and free. Next. We'll go to the next, since I think I covered that. I want to go to number 3, which is the principle of earlier the treatment, the better. I don't think it's a news bulletin to those that are with us today. It's great if you can get some kind of intervention to a young person who's already starting to use substances or suffering from a mental disorder. The line graph on the right just gives a representation of how much better somebody's long-term outcome from substance abuse treatment is improved the sooner that person gets treatment after they first start to experience problems. So the bottom line is, and it kind of makes sense, doesn't it? The sooner that somebody starts to show problems that person can get help, the greater likelihood that they'll more quickly have long-term recovery. But if you wait too long, many, many years, then once they get treatment, of course, the good news is they're finally getting treatment, but once they get treatment and they've had the problem for many years, it can be just a longer, tougher road, heavier lift, towards long-term recovery. The author of the slide, Michael Dennis, he calls it, careers are shorter the sooner people access treatment. Or you could make a case, careers are longer the later somebody accesses treatment. Now, this is representing substance use disorders, and success represented being abstinent for 1 or more years. Similar principles hold up for the other big disorders that teenagers suffer from, like ADHD, depressive disorders, anxiety disorders, PTSD. Same principles. Next. Oh, wrong direction, Steve.
I know. Matilda had asked if I just back up one slide.
Sorry.
I think she
Excellent.
wanted to just see slide or number 2 there. So I just was going to
Yes. Well,
you.
And I did skip it, but I wanted.
I know.
It's a good slide just because this is my editorial of what are 5 features of the best prevention programs out there, and all the good ones, I think, address all these features. You can see it's important, developmentally appropriate, addressing all substances, but also focusing on important skills.
Yeah. We'll just as a note too, we'll make these slides available in a PDF format and include those in a post-event email, and you can request CEUs at the time as well. So thank you.
Good. Steve wasn't making a mistake. I want to acknowledge that. I want that on audio. That's going to be in the transcript. Number 4, kind of related, use evidence-based treatment. So earlier the better, but you want to try to apply evidence-based. Now for adolescents, there are some great literature reviews. I've listed 3 of them here. Hogue et al., NIDAS, and Tanner Smith. I haven't read NIDA because I think that's one of the easiest to access, very readable. It's intended for a non-research audience, and it's still very relevant, even though it's a 2014 publication. All of these summaries of the treatment literature can tend to show that to greater or lesser degree, if you have a program or an approach that includes motivational enhancement therapy, cognitive behavior therapy to teach skills, and you include the family, at least the parents, you optimize outcome. To the degree you can't or don't have the luxury or decide not to include these 3 kind of major pillars of treatment, the odds are, according to literature summaries, you're maybe minimizing outcome, or you're not optimizing. Next. And there's just a slide that highlights one of my favorite. This is the NIDA report of 2014, Principles of Adolescent Substance Use Disorder Treatment, a research-based guide. But it's written for laypersons, and they lay out some easy to understand principles. I think there's 13 principles that they say reflect, optimal treatment. And to the left is just me summarizing what I think are the three main treatment strategies and approaches that you find in the best evidence-based treatment programs that are out there. Next. One reason I like the best programs is that they do a good job of teaching and supporting some decision-making skills. I've used the term self-regulation in the title here, but similar principle, in helping and improving decision-making skills. Here's 5 ways that can be done in good programs, steering teenagers toward better impulse control, being able to engage in second thought processes, good social decision-making. Boy, we're going to talk about that coming up with social media issues, dealing with risk situations, and then learning how to take healthy risk. It's great to have risk-taking tendencies in human nature. I think Paul could make a strong case that risk-taking is important for our evolution and for our cultures and and us as individuals to grow and advance. And in the teen years, there's a great tendency to want to take risks, perhaps more so than when you're an adult. And so it's great when you can help teens, or when teens decide that they can steer that towards healthy paths. As Steve says, there is wiring that contributes to risk-taking, which is a fascinating feature of the adolescent brain development. So a couple slides for us to reflect on the importance, though, of tailoring and adjusting and informing treatment for American Indian, Alaska Native youth, and not overusing westernized programs. Just got 3 basic principles here. It's important to include culture to enhance pride in Native traditions and to promote recovery. Doing so supports traditional healing practices and beliefs, and also understanding that the basic principle, there's no one right way of doing things. There's many paths to healing. That 3rd principle reminds me of the importance of good practices and good counseling, where you adjust things for given individuals or given communities, when you realize that there's different paths based on all kinds of features that you understand are part of the person or part of that community. And then a little bit more about when thinking on either culturally informing or adapting approaches for American Indian, Alaska Native youth. I think it's important to look at various features in that teenager. To what extent do they identify with their culture? Your willingness and ability to use traditional healing practices. Making sure that your program is relevant to the community and the needs of that community, as well as the adolescent client. Hopefully you appreciate the value of emphasizing strengths and asset building, and not just focusing on risk factors. Remember, every risk factor, you can turn it and reverse it and call it an asset if somebody has the absence of it. And so teaching someone to increase the opposite of risk, or the asset, is one way to emphasizing that direction, as opposed to just talking about got to reduce risk, got to reduce these harms. And then there's the issue of home-based implementation of any treatment program. This can be a great skill if you have this and you're in the treatment arena, because it can be difficult to set up a clinic, have an outpatient site or an inpatient treatment program, and think that it's easy for clients to come to you. All across America, we're challenged by that, but then that surely can be an issue for many of those that are in tribal communities. So being able to implement programs in the home is a plus. And I think many treatment manuals talk about that and provide guidance on how to do that. It also helps promote the family component. And then I've got two more on implications of this science and how that can help you. One is my push to help teens learn a little bit more about two of the maybe more recent threats in the substance use arena with teenagers. What are teenagers using more common in the last few years than in prior years? Well, cannabis and vaping, vaping nicotine, although of course, cannabis vaping is also out there. And so I call this increasing the cannabis and vaping IQ of adolescents. I have two sources there where you could go to those websites and you could take that information and turn it into a quiz, turn it into a contest. These two sites, one for cannabis and one for vaping, basically propose what are myths about that relevant topic, and then lend itself to how you can get young people to talk about it. What's the source of the myth? Maybe the myth is accurate, and who wants to defend it? What's your evidence or your supporting argument for defending it? It can lead to some, I think, some interesting discussions among young people. You can set up all kinds of contests and activities revolving around this idea. And then the sixth one, next slide, Steve, is to remind us all that teaching parents about brain development also can be helpful. We found that of great value when parents gain some insight about this science. So remember back, there was the book by Anthony Wolfe. There's the YouTube from Sarah Jane Blakemore. Those are two things we use for parents. If you go to the next slide, Steve, we also do this. We use this as a handout and then as a source of an activity when we're working with groups of parents. So the activity is where the parents get this handout, PARENT, and then they're briefly, we identify what the principle is for each letter. And then we get the small groups of parents to work and discuss each of the principles, or maybe a subset, and talk about if they had challenges with that principle. Did they have examples of where it worked? What do they see as issues revolving around the principle? And then we get the group of parents to come back and we talk about each letter or principle for the for that highlight letter. And it gets them to think about being good parents and also how to use teen brain science to strengthen their parenting. A lot of what we find from parents is that it's just a relief to know that the frustrations they're facing may be really some just part of normal adolescent brain development and normal adolescence, and that they don't need to blame oneself and to feel shame and to feel that they're a weak parent, but that they just need to hang in there and understand that this developmental period will pass. PARENT. There's yeah, very good. There's a excellent YouTube, I thought, that talks about the role of parents in promoting adolescent health. This comes from SAMHSA and from their Native Connections series. So it's what you have there is the YouTube of the webinar that talks about the importance of the family and the parent in steering young people towards wellness and health. Okay, I think now we're going next slide. It reminds us we're hitting the big part of my talk. So this is an overview of brain development, kind of what are the two basic principles, and then intersecting all of that with drug use, mental health, early experiences, both pro and con, or positive and negative, and then issues of social media. So next. One basic principle is that teen brain develops significantly during the adolescent years up until about age 25. So that was a big news bulletin. The good news is there is a majority of this early, we'll call it youth brain development, has been complete by around age 18 or 19, but there is still phenomenon extending up until about age 25. Next. And then the second principle is that the way the brain develops is in an uneven manner, ununiform manner. The back of the brain, which is often called the go system, or I call it the Nike part of one's brain, that kind of tells you to go for it and to seek out excitement and to be motivated for energy, and to like being with your friends and to experiment with risky things like substances. That part of the brain, which is more near the back, is developing faster than the front part of the brain, or sometimes called the brakes, which tells you to pause, reflect, engage in second thought, and to resist impulses, delay gratification, all of that wonderful things that we hope teens are good at and that we'd like to think are being used at important times of their life. It's not, that part of the brain isn't developing as quickly. So you could make a case that there's a dominance of the go system or the accelerator system of the brain dominating over the brakes that helps with pausing. Steve reminds us the Nike brain has in the Nike slogan, just do it. The Nike slogan of on second thought, that wouldn't make a good case. That wouldn't be a good marketing tool. So any phenomenon in the marketplace that's pitching interest in teens is to some degree, whether they formally know it or not, is probably capitalizing on the fact that they know teens like certain things. And this is a time of their life when they have a preference for these things and it becomes an attraction. Next. You might be able to see how this, I'm not sure this slide is working very well, but it's supposed to show sort of an enveloping process where the blue part of the brain is showing maturation, and you can see that, yeah, it's not working the same way. Don't worry about it. This, the good news is, oh, there we go. I think now we're seeing it. Yes, you should see this repeating of this bluing, and what's happening in an envelope type, back to front type way. This is one of the major brain maturation processes called myelination and synaptic pruning. And you can see that the last parts of this cycling of the blue is more near the front of the brain, and there's a lot of things getting blue near the back or middle. So this was using brain imaging data, and it's stitched together cohorts or series of young people that were scanned for a few years, and then they'd replaced with a different age and continued on. But brain imaging science has done a nice job of helping inform us about this underlying biological process. Next. I'm going to skip this. We'll go to the next one. We may come back to that. Yeah, you got to hit 3 times because I got 3 boxes. Okay, yeah, okay. This is an easier way to talk about the prior slide. Developmental psychologists have weighed in and identified what are features of adolescent behavior that might be attributable to the way the brain is developing during these years. And these 8 on this slide represent myself and my research team from synthesizing what developmental psychologists were writing about and hypothesizing about, and have come up with this one summary type slide. So 8 different ways you could make a case that we might look at adolescent behavior and think about, well, brain development might be part of or underlying what we're seeing among young people. Certain preferences, such as high excitement and novelty, not as good at controlling emotions, or not very good at considering negative consequences because positive features that the Nike part of the brain are being attracted to. And then you might see tendencies, very attentive to social information. Now that can be related to many of the things above, such as interest in high excitement, interest in peers, etc. And of course, phenomenon these days with the social technology has really accommodated easy access for teenagers to get social information. And then there's the issue of greater tendency to take risks and to show poor self-control. Now, there's big individual differences with that last one. You might reflect on your youth and realize, well, I was pretty good with risk. I didn't do too much to get in trouble. I personally do not have a great story of me as a teenager where my teen brain got the best of me and I went over the top by taking a risk. I've got stories of friends and what I observed in my high school along those lines, but I don't have a good personal example, and that might make sense because I'm kind of at the low risk or middle risk level, or my position on the spectrum of risk taking is at the low end. I mean, as an adult, I also could make the same case, kind of low risk taking. So not all of us, but if you're a teen that is the high end, this might be where during adolescence. When I mean high end, I mean at the high end of a risk taking trait. But during adolescence, then this might be a particularly vulnerable period where you get in trouble. If someone were to interview hedge fund managers of Wall Street, I bet we could get some interesting stories about where they had risk-taking tendencies in the teen years that might have been pretty spicy, maybe dangerous. And I bring that up because it strikes me hedge fund managers are by nature at the high end of risk-taking. That's why they are where they are. They're successful at taking risk, making money for people, and then elevating themselves to Wall Street and having that wonderful wealthy status, if you want to think of it as wonderful. And so anyone with, I think, a high-end risk-taking trait probably during the teen years could come up with some interesting examples of where risk got in the way. Next slide is where I have highlighted, if you hit next, in green, how though some of these traits might actually contribute to personal growth and contribute to being healthy, contribute to wonderful development. So our staff and I, we highlighted these 4, and you'll notice taking risks is one of them we highlighted because there surely can be healthy risk taking. Next is where we looked at the other side, said, well, but what are among these 8, what might be considered contributors of unhealthiness or unwise risk taking? And we identified 7 out of 8. Obviously, taking risks at the unhealthy direction was one of them, but many of these others, preferences for teen activities, excitement, novelty, difficulty controlling emotions, not appreciating or underappreciating negative consequences. If those were to dominate teens' decision making, and perhaps because biology is partially influencing that, you could see that you might get a little bit more tendencies of unhealthy risk taking. A reminder that risk-taking by teenagers has an important contextual factor. And this is great news really for us in the prevention and treatment field, because we want to capitalize on this small nugget here. That is, teen risk-taking is not because there's a cognitive deficit where they don't understand the true nature of risk. They do understand it when they have time to reflect on what happened or what they see around them. But what is the difficulty is that risk-taking can become under the influence of emotional and contextual factors. And many times that's because peers are creating that emotion and that context. And when you reflect on when teenagers engage in their most delinquent behavior, get in trouble the most with the law or with substance use, it's often intersecting with peer involvement. So the view that the teen has a difficult time kicking in their second thought process. Okay.
Oh my goodness. I have not had all of a sudden it said the meeting was over, and
I thought you had a power outage in Iowa there.
we had some kind of outage.
Yeah.
Okay, everyone.
Gremlins. All right. We got
let's settle
gremlins
back
in our
in.
computers.
Here we go.
I left off with context, peers, emotionality that all can steer decision-making by teens. The good news, the reason it's important to think about this is the good news is teenagers have the cognitive ability to be good decision makers. It's not fate, that the teen brain is going to steer them down the Nike path all the time. It's just, it's difficult. It's a challenge for the teen brain when they're faced with certain social, emotional situations. And I think I left with often when they're with peers, because often you get all of these, I call them negative, conspiring influences when one is with friends. But of course, being with their friends is very important. You can't be the fun police, whether you're a parent or a counselor, and tell teens not to be with their friends. In fact, it's very normal during the adolescent years to want to spend more time with same-aged than with adults and with parents. So, but teaching teens how to not let peer influence get the best of them then is such a key. We'll return to that. Steve, go to the next one, because I'm just going to go down now 4 different roads. Drug abuse is the first road here to talk about implications of all of this science and certain health issues. And so one big question is, are teens with that developing brain more vulnerable to the effects of drugs? And there are several lines of evidence that I think support this. Big studies with alcohol and with cannabis have focused on this question, and then some on related to nicotine. And all of those studies show kind of the same finding, that while all our brains are unfortunately susceptible to chemicals, psychoactive substances, alcohol, cannabis, nicotine, and methamphetamine, et cetera, the teen brain might even be more susceptible because it's developing in certain ways that make that vulnerability more extreme. Go to the next. Just reflecting on what we know about teenagers experimenting with substances, it's likely that most teens in modern times in westernized cultures will be using substances at the greatest frequency that they will at any other developmental period throughout their life. And many of you, if you reflect, you might come to that conclusion that, yeah, I used the heaviest or used the most, or I was high the most days, or whatever you want to plug in, probably occurred more frequently or more prevalent when you were a teenager than any other 10-year period as you grew up. So that would suggest, boy, there's a lot of phenomenon going on, obviously, that can steer teens towards substance use, but brain development may unfortunately be, one of the contributing factors. Next. Just a little sidebar on this topic. If you can get a young person to not use substances until they're about 21, you greatly reduce the risk of them experiencing a problem with that substance at some point in their life. So you can see with both the blue and the orange or grayish, I'm sorry, brown bars, that they get smaller or shorter as you go from left to right on the screen. Well, what's that reflecting? That the earlier you start to use a substance, the greater the likelihood at some point in your life you'll have a dependence on that substance. So that's the highest bars to the left, and way to the right, the last set is 21 plus, which says and shows, well, look at the significant protection, if you will, of waiting till later in life of using a substance for the first time, and how that forestalls the likelihood that you'll experience a dependence later on. Go to the next. I thought I would show you on the next slide a summary about alcohol and its impact on the teen brain. You can go, there you go. So one way to look at it is to the extent to which animal studies have informed us about this phenomenon. And because you can't do these studies with humans, with some animal studies, if they're designed in certain ways, they can be informative. And one principle that's been discovered is that adolescent rats, when given an opportunity to get intoxicated, to actually self-administer alcohol, they show two tendencies. One is less sensitivity to the acute intoxication effects, such as sedation and motor impairment. So they're less sensitive to those impacts, but they are more sensitive to how the alcohol creates more social interest or so-called social disinhibition. That's just a way of saying they feel more sociable. So you get, with animal models, you get this two phenomena: less sensitive to the negative effects of alcohol and more sensitive to the positive effects. Of course, not a good recipe because it can lead someone to find it very rewarding to use an alcohol during the teen years. We'll go to the next one after that. I just wanted to show a quote from a recent, whoops, too quick, show a recent quote. This was a study that looked at a lot of different investigations. So they're summarizing just a wealth of data over the last decade or two. And the quote is this: "Human evidence is largely missing, but animal research provides limited but consistent evidence of heightened adolescent sensitivity to chronic alcohol's effects on several outcomes, including conditioned aversion, dopaminergic transmission in reward-related regions, neurodegeneration, and neurogenesis." So a lot of big words here, but the authors could have just said several outcomes, including many that are related to adverse brain development phenomena. That's what all of these dopaminergic, neuro refer to. So because it's problematic to get this kind of evidence from humans, the authors highlighted what the animal literature is saying. But the ABCD study is going to give us an opportunity, because they'll be tracking brain development with brain imaging science underlying it, as well as course of use of substances. And we'll be able to see if we get more human evidence that can inform on the extent to which early use might have negative effects on brain development. Next is my interest in the marijuana topic or cannabis. Go to the next slide and I'll show you that it's important to think about brain development and cannabis, because we have many receptors, or so-called cannabinoid receptors, in the brain. They're related to all kinds of regions and functions. You can see to the left a breakdown of the various functions for which we have cannabinoid receptors. So when you ingest THC, whether you're smoking it or eating it, you're activating these receptors and you're having an impact on all these different kinds of functions. Go to the next slide, Steve, and it gives you a little bit more detail about what some of the scientists are saying. So I've taken some sound bites from a couple sources. Exposure to cannabis during adolescence can affect neurobehavioral functions, especially cognition, which is the way you learn, emotional functioning, the risk of psychosis and addiction. Another soundbite is thought to interfere with the normal trajectories and mechanisms underlying brain maturation. So this is important because contrary to alcohol, cannabis can impact how the brain systems are developing, because cannabinoid receptors are important for the development of the infrastructure and the processes going on in with brain maturation. It's a bit like saying alcohol doesn't help the girders of brain development, but cannabis or THC, that actually can damage the brain development girders, and thus that's going to have downstream impacts as the youngster continues to age into adulthood. Steve, go to the next, or hit next, because it's got this. I wanted to highlight that when researchers have tried to figure out what are all the potential health impacts of cannabis, they've also honed in on what impacts might be accentuated if somebody starts to use during adolescence or has adolescent onset of cannabis. And this slide reflects that. So in a Volkow and colleague review of the literature, they identified 8 ways in which cannabis might have some negative impact on the user's health. And they categorized the level of confidence of that research into low, medium, and high. But I wanted to show you that the Volkow and colleagues also identified 4 areas of health where if cannabis use begins during adolescence, there's even a greater or more pronounced negative health impact. And those health impacts are pertaining to altered brain development, increased risk for chronic psychosis, addiction, and diminished life satisfaction and achievement. So negative impacts for users, but even a more pronounced on some of these negative impacts if use begins during adolescence. Next slide. Go to the next one. Got to hit, I think, a couple, go even more, because I'm just going to summarize this. This was a study that showed how IQ might be deleteriously impacted with cannabis use. The bottom line of this study was that if individuals started to use cannabis before age 18 and used heavily throughout their adulthood, and you compared their IQ at age 16 to age 35, so you got these 2 IQ points, and then you got groups of people. But the heavy users and the early onset users, they had an average IQ drop of 8 points. The good news was if you waited till after age 18 and you didn't use heavily, you had either negative or negligible or no IQ drop. But the bad news is that early onset comes out again, and chronic use. And 8 IQ points, that's pretty significant. That's a half a standard deviation. Next, we'll go back to this one. I wanted just to reflect on a little sidebar topic. So many states have legalized cannabis for commercial sales. Now, all of the states that have gone that route, the minimum age is 21. But it is informative to ask the question, with states that have legalized commercial sales for adults, do you get changes in adolescent use? And then those studies also have an opportunity to look at changes in young adults as well as other variables. I thought I would just highlight for you that these researchers found 33 research reports for which there were survey data in studies in states for which there was how much cannabis was used among adolescents and young adults before those states legalized, and then had survey data after the states had legalized. So, to do pre-post, before and after. And then there were 23 adolescent studies, 13 young adult studies. So among the 23 studies, when they looked at, so was there change, increase or decrease? 10 studies, no change. 6 decrease, 7 increase. So for the bad news angle of things, among 23 studies, tried to look at pre-post impact of legalizing, 7 studies showed that there was an increase in adolescent use after commercialization. That's what the increase means. And you had some no change and some decrease. So there's some risk here. I mean, it's a little troubling. States that are legalizing, even though it's 21, some of them have seen an increase in adolescent use. The young adult studies, there were 13 of them, 8 showed an increase, 8 out of 13. So even more, I guess you might say, legalization impact among young adults. Young adults, 18 to 24 were the age range. And then some studies measured cannabis use disorder, and 2 of them were adolescent studies, and they both showed an increase. So this was reflecting perhaps the issue of, well, you might not always get more teens using if a state commercializes, but for those that are using, you might get an increase in heavier use and thus greater prevalence of those meeting criteria for cannabis use disorder. So something we'll be watching. More states might legalize every November now. It's something you can look to see if did any states go commercialization. I can't remember if I mentioned it. 19 states have commercialized plus the District of Columbia. We can go to the next. I'll come back to that later. So remember, I asked the questions, are adults more susceptible? I think several lines of evidence support it, but the question might be why. So why are they more vulnerable? So let's go to the next. Obviously, I'm making a case brain development might have a role. And remember this slide, 8 phenomenon of adolescence, and 7 of them could be related to why teenagers get curious to use and maintain drug use. Certain preferences, not having optimal attention towards things like emotion and negative consequences, and greater tendencies to behave in certain ways. All of these 7 could be just normal phenomenon, part of normal adolescence, but they for some edge that teenager to get curious about using and perhaps overindulge and get into trouble with drugs. So that's one possible explanation. Another one, next slide, is also related to brain development, but it's more specific because the way the teen brain is developing may be a risk for greater biological attraction to drugs. So you may know about the dopamine hypothesis of drug addiction. It's an important, physical, biological explanation for why humans get addicted to drugs. Of course, there's big individual differences in our dopamine systems, and there's a lot of, obviously, social determinants and environmental factors that are at play. But dopamine, the neurotransmitter in the brain, often called the reward neurotransmitter, gets activated at extreme levels when you ingest psychoactive substances. And that can lead to a cascade of problems, continued urges and continued use, and then downstream addiction. But the one concern is that the adolescent dopamine system is in its early development stage. In that early stage, contributes to even a greater sensitivity to drugs. So the analogy would be this: if you had a 15-year-old take a drug and you measured their dopamine excitement within 5 minutes of taking the drug, and then you had a 35-year-old who hadn't used that drug ever or any other drug, and they took the drug and you measured their dopamine excitement, you'd see a greater excitement index or feature in the teen, the 15-year-old, than the 35-year-old, just because of brain differences. Next slide. The third one here has to do with, and you can hit next again, Steve, so the animation will show up. There you go. This full slide is a little noisy, but it's basic principle here is using drugs in the teen years might prime the brain to be interested and sensitive biologically to that drug later in life. So it's a bit related to the dopamine sensitivity hypothesis, isn't it? It extends it with a principle that it's changing the structure of the brain, unfortunately, in ways that makes you more vulnerable to a drug addiction later in life. And as Steve reminds us, this goes back to age of onset. You see on the left some bars and you see a little mouse. Well, that was an animal study. Which was able to control for all kinds of factors, but it just showed that if you introduce nicotine to an adolescent rat and you compared it to a rat that was the same age but wasn't introduced to nicotine, and then you let those two rats not have any access to nicotine, you took away the nicotine access, but then you reintroduced nicotine to both rats when they were adults and you allowed them free access. Well, which rat do you think liked and went for the nicotine more frequently? That rat that during adolescence got introduced to nicotine. Its counterpart that had no introduction to nicotine had a minimal interest in the drug. So that's an animal example. But it could contribute to our understanding why one drug can be a gateway to other drugs. I know nicotine is often viewed as a gateway drug. Some people say alcohol, some people would say cannabis, but often teens move from one drug to multiple drugs, as well as adults. And unfortunately, the brain might be priming, for that type of characteristic. Next. I want to look at the time and see how we're doing. So go to the next slide. Steve, I want to just reflect and remind us all that many major behavioral and mental disorders have their onset during adolescence. And here's a list of 7 of them. It's not even a complete list, but it's a significant list because these are serious disorders and many of them contribute to a lifelong of problems. But for many individuals, there are early vestiges of these disorders during adolescence. There's going to be more science as understanding. So is the adolescent brain, for some, developing in ways that are contributing to development of these disorders? In other words, are there some abnormalities or some missteps in some teens' brain development that unfortunately conspires to lead to some of these problems? I think perhaps the most literature on this is with that first one in my bullet, ADHD, and the bottom one, schizophrenia, where people have enough data sets and looking at brain imaging before and after onset of disorders and stitching together what's going on and making a case that there's some logic to that biology. We're starting to see that principle hold up. It reminds us that brain development is so important for more than just risk for substance use disorders. Next, this is a reminder, another way of saying a lot of disorders onset during the teen years. Those numbers you see there, 11, 20, 30, those are just representing age of onset for half of people that eventually develop the disorder. So it tells us 2 things. There are some disorders where a lot of people start to develop them at early ages, like age 11 and under 20. But of course, some of these disorders will onset later in life. It's not fate. There's surely later or adult onset of all kinds of disorders. Next. Go to the next. I'm just going to bring to bear the conversation with you on the next slide. The unfortunate role marijuana might play in contributing to early onset, adolescent onset disorders. A researcher looked at this literature the intersection of cannabis use and whether that elevated a person's use of a disorder. And she found data for 5 disorders, with risk of suicide being the 5th. But she then further analyzed the data and further examined it, because she's doing a literature review, and found that for schizophrenia, bipolar, and risk of suicide, there was even a greater propensity to develop these disorders if the person used cannabis in the teenage years. So that early onset of cannabis even further enhanced an unfortunate risk, an unfortunate path towards serious mental disorder. Next. Next. Too much detail for us, kind of same point. Next slide. Just a reminder, when we try to look at the link between substance use and any mental disorder, whether we're looking at it with the teen years or non-teen years, that it's problematic. It's a complicated topic, because does the substance use cause the mental disorder? Does it contribute to a worsening of the symptoms? Or does it have no role at all? And it's just a marker that the person has a risk for that disorder. And whether they used or not, they were going to get the disorder or not. So it's complicated. More longitudinal studies are showing up. In the literature. I think the data is getting strong that cannabis, while it doesn't cause psychosis in a person not at risk, but if you're at risk, there's data suggests it contributes to an earlier onset of the psychosis and a worsening course. That is, you have more episodes, and when you have the symptoms, they're worse, as opposed to an individual who doesn't use cannabis would still develop psychosis, but just at a lighter, lower level. Next. And the next slide, just a reminder that there's the environment to consider when we think about brain development. With the next slide, it's just wanted you to realize that the researchers are studying this and looking at positive and negative influences. And so teaching young people resiliency traits helps provide more protection in their environment, and addressing teens that have been subjected to trauma and getting them treatment and helping remove the trauma, teaching coping skills will reduce the risk and the impact of that trauma on brain development. So it's a wonderful time of one's life to try to just elevate assets and teach resiliency and coping skills, and to, when things are going bad, to intervene as quickly as possible. Steve, just hit about 3 more next slides. Keep going, one more. Here we go. Actually, and then one after this. It's just one study. I'm going to give the upside to it, and then hit again, because it's an animation. This is a great study that showed when you had infants get a lot of parental support versus infants that did not, because they were unfortunately without parents and they were in institutions. There was a big difference in how their brain developed. And the one big difference was in a region called the hippocampus. And those that had good parental support, they had more strength in their hippocampus. And why would that be important? Well, that helps you with memory and learning and emotional regulation. So it's a plus to have, nice, strong hippocampus. Well, it was linked to, early childhood parental support. So those in an orphanage that had minimal contact with adults and not that closeness you'd get from a parent, they had an adverse outcome. Now, that doesn't mean it's fate, because hippocampus volume could be improved as a person grows up, gets more support, moves out of the orphanage, gets adopted, et cetera, et cetera. So, but it does show how, environment can influence how the biology is is working in a person. So let's go, Steve, to the bit on social media. Keep going, keep going. There we go. I just wanted to remind people that modern technology is taking advantage of the teen brain, and maybe not always in good ways. The social media attraction is for screenagers, as someone has coined, can be both good and bad news. I'm just focusing a little bit on the bad news today, but as you can imagine, with modern technology and improvement of the speed and the power of the chip and electronics, that it can lead teenagers and that teen brain to spend way too much time, because that's social media source can provide all kinds of positivity, or at least viewed as positivity, like micro rewards, social affirmation, making sure you don't miss out. And of course, there's all on the downside. It can also be a source of bullying, negativity, can actually enhance somebody's low self-esteem and elevate the negativity that somebody has about themselves. Yes, and Steve reminds us it impacts adults too. Just go to the next slide, a reminder that teens that spend too much time on the screen, whether it's their cell phone or laptop, they tend to have a worse psychological profile. Now, it's quite possible that this is correlational and it's not causal, but I think a lot of people are, realize that you have somebody that might be at risk for depression or have maybe subclinical depression, for example, but then they get too involved in screen time, and that just further aggravates that depression and accelerates it, and leads to then more blues. So in that ways, it potentiates the depression, not causing it in the classic sense, but having a contributing role in somebody's problem with depression. Where on the other hand, if somebody with low-level subclinical depression stays away from the screen, the experts are hypothesizing they'd have a lower probability of developing a clinical level. Next slide. Just some strategies, basic stuff the experts talk about, how to restrict, how to get teenagers to be smart with screen time, limits, seeking support. You might be informed if you watch the Netflix documentary, The Social Dilemma. It's kind of an eye-opener. Basically, it advances the themes I'm talking about, how too much screen time can be way too powerful in a negative way. So to summarize, I know we're at the end. Next slide, just a reminder, adolescence is a wonderful developmental period. A normal teen shows all kinds of things that might frustrate us, but it's quite normal for teens to be irritable, take risks, complain about being bored, want to spend more time with friends than with the family. Next. Well, no time for drilling a little too deep. And then a reminder, this will be my last summary slide, and I'll have Steve turn it back to remind people about follow-up activities, but a reminder that Nike and the Just Do It slogan is one way to remember what is the main feature of that teen brain. It loves excitement, likes rewards, and that's going to probably predominate over a second thought type trait or habit, and it means they're probably going to like the rewards more than perceiving negative consequences. So a preference for rewards, less interest in considering the consequences. Not that there isn't the cognitive ability for teens to override the Nike brain tendencies. You can skip that. You can skip that, Steve, and skip that. I want to, yes, let's give the answers to the
quiz,
brain quiz.
the
I
infamous
know you're all
quiz.
on the edges of your seat. 2 health indices that suggest less risk taking. Are they decline in teen pregnancy and very low rate of cigarette smoking? Is that a true or false? Hit the return button, Steve, and we'll get the answer. Animation should pop up. True, yes. So that's good news. Obviously, as you may know, the low rate of cigarette smoking is being ousted by the unfortunate increase in vaping. Second, true false question. Brain development of native adolescents follows the same basic principles as with non-native adolescents. True or false? That is true. Same principles, but of course, individual differences. Differences in social determinants, culture, environment will lead to differences among young people, and some of those may fall along racial or ethnic categorizations, but the basic phenomenon looks to be true. And which is more harmful? Regular use of cannabis, regular binge drinking, or regular vaping of nicotine? My answer is good question, because there's not really a good answer. They're all problematic. They all can contribute to harms. We don't know yet how to rank order the relative harms of those. In fact, we may never really want to go down that road, because it's they all have their specific harms, and then some of the harms though are generic. Regular substance use, it just is not good for the developing brain. We can probably agree on that. Okay, Steve.
Yeah,
Back
that
to
last
you.
question I think was a trick question, so you got me on that one.
It was actually, any answer you gave would be a correct one.
Yeah, that's right.
As long as you didn't disavow
right.
the other two as being terrible answers.
We
Right.
we are just past our time. I want to again apologize for the roller coaster of technical difficulties that we seem to have. I guess we were due for some technical problems. Things have been going so well recently. So thank you for the small group that was able to get back on and be with us. And I want to thank Ken for sharing some of his knowledge and passion with us. And we'll try and do this again. We're going to broadcast next month. I think we're going to be talking about a portion or a component of substance abuse or substance use disorder screening, part of the evaluation process. So please join us next month. We'll broadcast first Wednesday of that month, and we'll hopefully have a little bit better luck technology wise. So if some of you are also asking about follow-up, we'll reach out to you if you registered for this event. We have your email, and we will reach out to you with a PDF version of these slides, as well as an opportunity to request CEUs for today's broadcast. So I want to thank everybody again for sticking with us, and we'll see you again next month, if not before. And until then, please stay safe, stay healthy, and of course, stay connected. So take care, everybody. Thanks again, Dr. Winters, and for everyone that was able to get back on for the call. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of the week.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.